Thank you for joining me for another episode of Build Your Poetry Manuscript with KMA. I am KMA Sullivan, the founder and publisher at YesYes Books. And in episode 7, we're going to take a look at choosing the poems for your manuscript. The first thing I'd ask you to do is to disconnect from your work somewhat. It's important for you to be able to see the difference between poems that are important to you personally versus poems that are important to the manuscript you are building. So, for example, perhaps a poem is important because it was pivotal in your journey as a writer. We all have those poems that open up and show us the possibilities of what we can do with our work. Or a poem is important to you because of the heart of that particular poem. Perhaps it's the only poem you've written to honor a loved one who has passed. These are two examples of poems being important to you as an individual, but they are not reasons to include them in the manuscript. Those exact same poems may have other reasons to be included in the manuscript, and that's great, but they're going to need other reasons. Once you have disconnected from your poetry somewhat, you will have a clearer eye, which you can use to make choices. And what kind of choices need to be made? First of all, look at the level of your poetry. Some of our poems are simply not as strong as others. And in a poetry collection, it's important that the work be of similar high quality in terms of language and mastery of construction. You probably know which poems are a little weaker, though it's hard to see if the poems present to you as important for emotional reasons, for personal reasons. Another question to ask yourself is this poem an outlier? Now, I am not suggesting that there should be no outliers in a manuscript. There are actually many good reasons why outliers make sense and are in fact very important to the manuscript as a whole. If you have some outliers, and they can be outliers in different ways. They could be outliers in form. They could be outliers in heart or language. Put those to the side and see if the manuscript you're putting together ends up needing those outliers. Another thing to look for when going through your poetry is, have you begun writing your next book? A lot of us take years to write the poetry that it is included in a final manuscript. And sometimes we've actually moved on in our creative process to the next book. That can happen very subtly, quietly, when you're looking at a group of poems that you are fashioning into a manuscript. Ask yourself that question. Are there poems in this group that are strong, that I think would work well in a manuscript, but is it this manuscript that they belong in? Another question to ask yourself is, has there been a progression of heart, a progression of understanding in the general topic theme that is present in the manuscript you are constructing? And I would say that that is not necessarily a reason to remove a poem or more than one poem. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they belong in the next manuscript. Maybe, that's a question you're going to have to ask yourself. But progression of heart is important in a manuscript. It is absolutely okay to have poems that have different hearts, that have poems that have different forms, different mechanics included in the same manuscript. You don't want to be writing the same poem over and over and over again for the same manuscript. If that has happened, then you need to ask yourself, what's different about this poem to that poem? If it's in generally the same landscape, it needs to offer something new to the manuscript as opposed to a slightly different repetition of the same point. I would encourage you to include different types of poems in your manuscript, especially if you're dealing with pretty heavy and intense subjects. It's a good idea to have a group of poems that can serve as a breather for the reader. That doesn't mean that they're weaker in terms of language, but they're just different. They might offer a resting place for a moment before you ask the reader to dive in again. In next week's video, we'll be taking a look at the form of the manuscript as a whole. I'm going to talk about bringing together different types of poems and how to arrange them to end up with a cohesive manuscript. It's important to remember that a collection is considered full length if it contains 48 pages of poetry or more. And that's 48 pages in a designed interior, which could even be 30 pages of poetry in a pre-designed manuscript. It all depends on how much of the page your work is taking up. So chances are there are a lot of poems that could be removed from the manuscript that you are putting together. And I really want to encourage you to remove as much as possible so that the manuscript is as strong as possible. As an editor, my feeling is that manuscripts are each a type of being, a being attempting to come into existence. That's what I feel when I'm in the revision process. And as a poet, I believe that I need the same type of relationship to the manuscript itself. It's not simply an expression of my language or my craft. I'm creating something that wants to and needs to live in the world. That perspective, I believe, does help us make choices. Disconnect from your work so that you have a clearer eye. Remove the work that is weaker. You can put it aside and work on it to make it stronger, but it's important to be honest with yourself about that. Remove the work that seems to be aiming toward the next collection. Acknowledge where the anomalies are and put them to the side. They absolutely may be important for the finished product, for the finished manuscript, but you need to note to yourself, that's an anomaly. So let me pay attention as I'm putting together the manuscript, and then ask myself, does it belong? And acknowledge and also respect the different types of poems that are probably in that manuscript group. The work does not need to be homogeneous in order to be in the same manuscript, not at all. Though, on the other hand, there have been and are some brilliant manuscripts where each piece in the manuscript is actually similar in some regard. These videos are 10-minute bites, 10 to 12 minutes. My hope is they will be useful. They are far from exhaustive on any given topic that we're taking a look at. Thanks for being here today. Have a great rest of your day.